Hello everyone and welcome to this occasional series of talks and readings organised by Literature Ireland in the summer of 2021. It's my great pleasure to welcome Christine Dwyer Hickey here today. Christine was born in Dublin. She's a novelist, playwright and short story writer. She's published books such as The Lives of Women and Tatty. Her latest novel, which we'll discuss today, The Narrow Land, won 2 major prizes in 2020, the Walter Scott Prize for Literary Fiction and the inaugural Dalkey Literary Award. Tatty was named one of the 50 best books of the decade. It was designated as the Dublin One City One Book in 2020. Christine's first play, Snow Angels, premiered at the Project Arts Theatre in 2014. Christine has taught creative writing through workshops and masterclasses in various locations around the world and has travelled extensively. With the support of Literature Ireland, her work has been widely translated, and we already have editions in Italian, Danish, Polish, Estonian and Arabic, and I understand The Narrow Land is soon to appear in Dutch, German and Polish. So Christine, we're going to talk about The Narrow Land.
Okay.
And first thing I'd say is that everybody I know who's read this book has raved about it. It's such an enjoyable book. Inspired by Edward Hopper and his wife. Why Hopper?
Well, it didn't start out off being about Hopper. He was only supposed to have a little cameo role on the side of a dune, painting with an easel in front of him and a paintbrush in his hand. But somehow himself and his wife, Josephine, muscled in on the novel and began to take over. So once, I don't know, that just came about. It happens sometimes with a novel that you start writing one particular novel and it turns into something else, and which was the case. I should say, usually I'm a little bit snooty about people who write about real people who existed. I think it's a bit intrusive. I've been known to make, to voice my reservations, and then I go ahead and do the exact same thing myself. So never criticise anyone is the message there.
And what about Hopper? I mean, did you particularly love his work?
I loved his paintings, but I knew very little about him, I have to say. And I started the novel with just the little boy, the refugee boy, Michael. And he'd been hanging about in my head for a few years. And I happened to be on a trip to Boston, an event. I was doing a writer's event. And I took a few days off and went to Cape Cod. And myself and my husband ended up in this part of Cape Cod, which is really, really quiet. Most people associate Cape Cod with, the Kennedys and yachting and glamour and all this, but this is a very quiet part, Truro, North and South Truro. And while I was there, I heard that Edward Hopper had a house, himself and his wife had built a house, summer house there, and they went there every summer for about more than 30 years, and that's where they went to paint. They lived in an apartment in Washington Square, otherwise in New York. So once I heard that, I started to kind of think about, as I said, him on the two of them painting on the side of the dune, and my little boy Michael seeing them. And the minute I saw that area in Cape Cod, I knew that would be the location. And I always think, if you have your location when you're writing a novel, that's your start. I look at it like I'm making a movie, and my location is my start. And it's very important that I feel something, some kind of an affinity, or I get something back from the location. I feel I want to know it better. So that's how that started. So I wasn't too long into the novel when Edward Hopper just started to become a much more interesting character. As I did my research and I found out about the Hoppers, they had a very difficult marriage, and really they didn't just go there to paint, they went there to fight and to kill each other. They used to have terrible rows. So I thought they were a very interesting couple. And she was very interesting in particular, and I just gradually sort of started to explore that.
Did you know that she was an artist?
No, I didn't really know she was an artist, and when I read up about her, I started to understand that she was bitterly disappointed in her life, and that she felt that she'd been overlooked because she was a woman, and she'd been overlooked because her husband was such a famous artist, and that generally speaking, people were out to get her. When you read her diaries and you read her letters, this is the message that you get. And that would have been a very easy route for me to take. That would have been ideal. But there was something wrong. There was something that didn't ring true as I went on with my research. I was watching quite a lot of a documentary called Edward Hopper and the Blank Canvas. And I watched it while I was recovering from quite a serious operation and suffering from insomnia. And I used to lie on the sofa in the afternoon and watch this documentary and fall asleep to the sound of their voices and to, you know, and it kind of like they entered my head and I seemed to enter their marriage. And he was 6'7", he was very big, and she was only 5 foot nothing. And he rarely spoke. She never stopped speaking. She's full of energy. She was really vibrant, very, very, very clever woman, I have to say. And I was able to see them, so that was great. That was great, and I was able to see Cape Cod and the location and all that. But then when I started to read about them, sometimes in the work I came across, there would be a letter that she'd written, and she might say in one letter, "Edward is such a wonderful man. He's the best husband anyone could ever want. He does so much for me. I'm so lucky to have him. He is a wonderful, wonderful man. And then he is such a bastard. This will be the next day. Who does he think he is? And he stops my career and he won't let me drive the car." And, you know, so she was very volatile. And she kept, you know, and I noticed everything I came across that said anything bad about him was coming from her and nobody else. So I wanted to explore that. And I kind of wanted to give him a voice because I think that when we die, people can say anything about you, you know. I'd had a few experiences of biographies written about Charles Dickens and about James Joyce that I felt there was very little proof. It was supposition, and so there might be supposition on page 10 and that will become a fact by page 25, you know. And I think it's so unfair. I think if there's a chance that it won't stand up in court, that a biographer shouldn't use it, really, I think. Anyway, but and I felt that. I felt strongly about that when it came to Edward Hopper. It just didn't tally with the documentary I'd seen, some of the things I'd read about, which his friends had written about him, and with his work, and this particular biographer who really took her side with very little evidence, I felt anyway. So, but as it progressed, I got fond of Jo Hopper. I sort of felt sorry for her, you know. I felt very sorry for her as the novel progressed.
In the book, you refer a lot to her childlessness, and the fact that she refers to the paintings as his paintings as her children, and to her paintings as stillborns. It's very emotive language. Was that your language?
No, it's hers. Most of the things, most of the mad stuff she says is hers. I'd see it in I tried. You see, the difference in writing a novel like this and any of my other novels is they're not my characters. They already exist. So they're not my characters. And I don't think you can say that about...
most novelists' characters are invented.
No, they're invented usually. So you know, you have license, you have poetic license. But with this time, it was different. So I tried, if I saw something that she wrote, like she writes in a letter, I bit his hand to the bone. So I tried to invent a little reason why that happened and how that happened. You know, or if she said, and she frequently said, she would refer to her own paintings as my stillborn bastards, is what she'd say. And his would be, I was there at the conception. And that was very important for her, to be there at the conception while he's thinking about the painting and while he's, you know, and to christen it. She christened it. She did come up with most of the names of his paintings. And she also, on the other hand, went on about how she never wanted children. We don't want children. Kids just get in the way of your work. It's all about our work. But somehow I felt a disappointment, nonetheless, an underlying disappointment. And that I explored that in it by bringing these two young boys into their lives. She always said, Eddie has no time for kids. He can't stand kids. But other people said, the Hoppers came down to see it, just to visit, and he was so good with the kids, and he drew funny pictures for them, and he was such fun, and the kids loved him. So you're kind of thinking, well, why does she keep saying this, you know? And also the physical difference in them. Just because she was the little one didn't mean she wasn't the bully. She was the bully, I think. You know? Yeah.
And when these two little boys arrived, why did you pick these particular boys?
Well,
they've quite a history.
They have quite a history, both. Well, first of all, I picked the location, and then I picked the year 1950, which I think is a very interesting year in American history, because you know the war was over, the Second World War was over, people were getting used to living without the idea of war. America was becoming very wealthy; it had made money during the war, and the standard of living was shooting up, just absolutely shooting up, and also. Men had been away during the war and women had taken over, they'd run their lives. But now the government wanted the women to step back. And in order to do that in a peaceful way, they started to market the idea of the American housewife. So the American housewife would have a frilly pinny and a little waist, and she'd have a station wagon in the driveway and a beautifully fitted kitchen. And her husband would always say, "Hi, honey," and he'd always be all over. And her kids were always good. They might be a little bit bold now and then, just to show they have a bit of life in them. But you know, there was no problems. Yeah. So a lot of people tried to buy into that, but I felt that there was a tension, an underlying tension. And I felt Josephine Hopper felt it too. You know, she was an early feminist, but unfortunately, she didn't like women, but that was just the problem there. But anyway, the first little boy, Michael, came to me, was given to me in a way by a translator, I'm sure you know, Hans Christian Usen, that's how you pronounce his name. And I wrote to him and I said, "Oh gosh, after the book came out, I'm so embarrassed I never ran this by you, but do you remember we were in Leipzig and I was there with you, and you brought us that lovely tour we had, to the Leipzig fair. And we were having dinner and he was sitting beside me and he was talking about Berlin after the war. And he talked about the amount of children who suffered the malnutrition that they suffered from, and that they would go on trains to farms to be fattened up, and some of them then would go on to be adopted into America. And I said to him, "Oh my God, like little piggies going to the market to be fattened up." And he said, "Yes, exactly." And that phrase stayed in my head, and the idea of a little boy going to this with strangers, going to a farm to be fattened up and then sent off because they were so thin and orphans, you know.
And traumatised.
Absolutely traumatised. And I read a very useful book for me, was Anthony Beevor's Berlin, 1945, which is a wonderful book. And it tells more about that. And I also read up about Truman's, the American President Truman. He had published this directive that said, it is now 1946, there are far too many people still left in camps in Europe, and children who are orphans. I want them out of there, bring them to America, do whatever you have to do with their papers, just get them here and we'll try and get as many adopted as possible, you know. So that was in my head too. So Michael was in there just waiting for an opportunity, and then when I came to Cape Cod, I knew I was going to have to get him somehow from Berlin to Cape Cod. Then I thought, he's going to need a pal. So I think it's an experience a lot of us have had, that just because you're children, sometimes you're put with somebody else, you're matched up with somebody else. I was an only girl growing up, and I was often sent to people's houses to be company for somebody, or they would be company for me. And so you go into a strange house, and you mightn't necessarily like the child, or the child mightn't necessarily like you, but you're put together, and I just kind of think it's an interesting dynamic. And so I gave his counterpart was Richie, who was the child of a wealthy American family, whose father was a soldier and had been killed, was an officer in the American Army and the US forces, and he'd been killed during the war. And where Michael, my little German boy, had also lost his father, who was a soldier during the war. So they had that in common.
But they didn't like each other.
They didn't like each other. So it's good to have something in common, but at the same time, you have this pull because they're both from different sides. Richie is needy. Michael has learned how to protect himself by this very strange independence that he has. He steals things and he hides them, and he's terrified of hunger. And he becomes friendly with Josephine Hopper, with Joe Hopper. And Richie sort of becomes more friendly with Edward Hopper. You know, they form this sort of alliance. Yeah.
And both Edward Hopper and Michael half fall in love with Catherine.
Catherine is another, this is something else. You see, when you're writing a novel, very few people sit down and know exactly what's going to happen and where they're going next, and you know, all that kind of thing. And sometimes the gods are good to you and they'll hand you something. Even if they hand you something terrible, you can make use of it. So two things happened. I had been diagnosed as having cancer of the kidney, and had that operation and all that kind of stuff. And I was in seeing my specialist, and he said to me, you know, well, you're very lucky. If this was the 1950s, we would have had to crack your ribs to get at that kidney, and then you probably would have died anyway, he said to me, you know. So I went ping, something went off my head, you know. And so I was in Montreal, and myself and my husband went to a concert of the Gustav Holst, the Planet Suite. And while I was sitting there, and everybody was coming in, and there was a very famous conductor who was supposed to be in charge that night, but he was ill. So his place was taken by this very small girl with a ponytail right down her backside, really long ponytail. And she looked like a child from behind, but she had such energy, and the ponytail was swinging like this, you know, while she was conducting. And they played the first movement, which is the Bringer of War. And I said to myself, oh God, that's like Jo Hopper. Everywhere she goes, she causes a row. So she's bringing the war with her. But so is Michael. I had her in mind at the time, and I had Michael. I knew I had Michael. I had the first chapter almost written. And he brings the war with him. It's always going to be in his head and in his heart and all that. So I thought, well, yeah, that they fit in. And then they played Venus, and I thought, this woman just formed in my head, this sickly looking woman. But and I found her. I didn't know this painting, or if I did, I didn't pay attention to it. But I'll show you the painting anyway. I found her when I got home in this painting, and it's you can see this house.
And she's in the doorway.
And she's in a doorway, and she's very tall, okay? And she's got blonde hair, and she's very tall. And she kind of just, it sounds really weird now because I'm not a bit like that. I'm usually very down to earth. But she kind of walked in mid-air while the music was going along. And I thought, and I know what I'll do. I'll give her cancer of the kidney. So the two boys are saying, and she had to, you know, they think, you know, the way young boys are gory, the idea of her hammer being broken, her ribs being broken with a hammer. So she's Richie's aunt. And this painting here was painted in 1949. So I put it into the book so it's in the previous year, and it's the last painting that Edward Hopper painted that summer, 1949. And I invented how he came across it. He had great difficulty finding a subject. And he didn't paint until he had the painting in his head. And in this particular thing, he really did do this. He built a little house to see where the shadows fell. Oh, he was very good at his hands. He built this little house. So I have Jo Hopper showing Michael the little house, taking it down and showing him the house. Okay. And she posed for all his paintings. Once they met, she never let another model pose for him. It was always going to be her. She was very jealous and very possessive. And she at 5 foot nothing posed for this and complained about it and said, he has me in a little shift, wearing hardly anything at all, and I had to stand there for hours. But the woman that comes out of it is taller, which happens in a lot of his paintings. A tall, buxom woman appears in the paintings, even though Jo, who was very slight, is his model. So that was something else that I followed up. I kind of started finding this. But when I saw this, I thought, that's her. That's exactly the woman I saw. So I used that painting for that. I see. And I went back to my specialist and I said, I gave one of the characters cancer of the kidney in 1950. Oh, Jesus, he said, you're not going to kill her, are you? I said, look, I'm afraid sometimes things don't always work out the way we expect.
Oh my goodness.
So I didn't actually say she was dead, but, you know, it's implied she's not going to get through this.
So the little boy is in love
with
her.
So he has a big crush on her.
He's a big crush. It's very Freudian. I mean,
yeah,
he really wants to sleep with this woman, but he doesn't even understand that that's what he wants.
Yeah.
Which is charming in a child that young.
Yeah.
He's just on the cusp of
she understands him or something.
And she understands that.
Yeah, and she kind of understands him, and she has that kind of quality that sometimes people have when they're near death or they think they're near death, and there's just something, most of ordinary things don't matter anymore.
And she says that to Hopper, doesn't she? She invites him to the beach and says...
Yeah, she does, yeah. And Hopper gets this thing about her. And I know one American publisher had said to me, or an American agent had said, you know, or implied that, you know, maybe you should have something going on between them. But I knew Hopper would not be the sort of man to have sex on the beach with Catherine. But I do have, it's all in his head, all what he thinks. And he says to himself, while she's standing on a table pinning decorations up for Labour Day for the party, he says, if I was one of those other guys, if I was Picasso or one of those other guys, I would go up to her now and just, put his arms around her legs and lift her off. But so it's all in his head.
It's the idea of her.
Yeah, it's the idea of her. I always think, you see, Sinead, when I'm writing a novel, that you get all your opposites in a way, and then there's all these sort of threads that go and they get tighter and tighter. So Edward and Michael were opposite for that, and she was somehow the thread in the middle. They were bringing each other closer and closer until it gets tighter, and you keep doing. It's hard to explain, but I know what it means in my own little mad head. But that's until you feel a weight, and you think, yeah, it's not going to fall now. That'll hold. So that's why I had the three of them and that little piece of.
It's a cliche to say triangle, but
it's one of the several. There's lots of little triangles and squares and all that kind of thing in it, but it's just the thread going through from one to the other. Yeah.
And what about Richie then on the other side and his obsession, or I suppose at one level he just wants a daddy figure.
He just wants a daddy.
Grieving his dead father.
He's grieving his dead father. His mother has sort of hit the bottle. She isn't paying much attention to him. His grandmother, who's a very good woman in lots of ways, she raises a lot of money and she's kind of, Mrs. Kaplan, she's the same. She just does her own thing and she's a very independent woman. And there was a few women who worked like that for the government, for Truman and that, and they raise money and they settle the orphans and all this kind of thing. So I used her as one of those kind of women. And so he's very much alone. And then when Michael comes, he doesn't get on with Michael. And he's also a little bit spoilt and a little bit whingy and a little bit sort of annoying as well.
So is it difficult to get those children's voices? I mean, writing a child is very different from writing an adult.
It is, of course, yeah. I have a very strong memory of childhood. And I always think maybe it's because I sort of lived my childhood on red alert in some ways. My parents, it's common knowledge at this stage, of course, but they split up and they had a quite difficult marriage as well. So when your parents are like that, you're always anticipating the row. So you're very aware. You nearly see it coming. And also because I went to a lot of different houses. I went to boarding school when I was young. You're always having to get used to a different environment. And I just remembered and noticed other kids. I just remembered and I just noticed other children and remembered how they speak. And I think it's Picasso who said, of course he only said it about men. All men are born as artists, but we'll include everybody. Everybody is born as an artist, but the problem is not everybody remembers it. Most people forget. A lot of people anyway forget their childhood, but I don't. I think maybe because my development was stunted a bit that I never really grew up, so I have it. And with my own children, I had it too. I had my children young. I was young, and so I would be aware of children and how they think and how they speak,
and how they behave. I mean,
and how they behave.
You have both children have hidey holes where they ferret away objects.
Yes,
and this becomes a crucial element of the plot.
Yeah, I never did that as a child, but I do know, a boy that used to come and stay with us, and he used to hide under the bedclothes and eat chocolate. And I always thought it was very sad, although my own children were outraged at this because he wasn't sharing the chocolate. But I thought I knew why he was doing it. It was a substitute for a loneliness in his own life, And
you refer to loneliness in the book. I mean, Hopper talks about Richie and says that he thinks he's the loneliest person he's ever met. Yeah,
he is. He's a very lonely boy. And I think Hopper, people always associate Hopper with loneliness, and even now, especially in the COVID time, he's found new admirers, and they all, there's a thing going on social media. We are all in Hopper paintings now because so many of them are people on their own. And he said, in one of the interviews that's in that documentary, he says, well, I don't know, I guess I might seem to be a lonely guy, but it doesn't feel like that to me. I just wanted to paint light on the side of a house. But I think he was not lonely in the way we understand it, but he liked solitude. He had his own, he had his own interior life. He had a very strong interior life. So he liked to read on his own and he liked to be on his own. But he's quite sociable too. Other people reckoned he was sociable,
But isn't that the eternal challenge for an artist? You can't make art.
Yeah, you can't make it if you're
at a party.
No, you can't. Well, you can. Some things that click into the back of your head, but he needed solitude and he liked it, and it was what he was, you know. But the loneliness is there. I found there's a loneliness about that place in Truro. Like, you know, above it, as I said, below it is the playground for wealthy Americans. Above it is Provincetown, which used to be an artist's colony, but it's very much a centre where people from conservative backgrounds in America appear to go to be gay in peace, you know. So it can be very camp in the summer, to the point that we would think, what's the big deal? Why do they have to, you know, you think you're on a Dick Emery 1970s walk sometimes, but this is because in their own lives, some of them haven't come out and they have to go there, you know, so, but it's wild, you know, it is wild. And then you come down to this place that's just otherworldly. It's like it hasn't changed since the Pilgrims landed. So you have the bay on one side, Cape Cod Bay on the other side, the Atlantic on the other side, this narrow strip of land, the narrow land as they call it. And you could walk for miles and not meet another soul. But the wildlife is the same. I mean, I went back. I went after, I was there for a few days during that trip, and then we went back again and rented a house on the same beach, Fisher Beach, and stay there for a few weeks, just to know what it was like to be, not to be Edward Hopper, because you couldn't really know that, but as near to as possible as what it was like for him to step out in the morning and look at that sea, or look at that sky, or walk on that beach, you know, that kind of thing. The house, I can show you a picture of the house if you like. The house is very well protected, nobody lives in it, but it's very difficult to get anybody to let you near it. But I made my poor unfortunate husband do a little bit of light trespassing, and we made our way to the house. There it is there, you see.
Oh, it's in splendid isolation.
There it is there in splendid isolation. I think that maybe that house is the one that's gone. No, that's still there. There it is there. And really, when you're even up at the house, you can't really see that house there. But I reckon that's where, say, the Kaplans were living. And you came down to the beach. So he was, if we're keeping up the music thing, he was Saturn, the bringer of old age. So there's that boom, boom, really slow music.
And he's always behind the others because he's not that steady on his feet.
He's not steady on his feet, and he looks like his swimming is going now. But this is me sitting outside going, oh no, we invented this invisible dog called Rover, and Rover was very bold. He was always getting lost in the scrubs and the work around there. So I used the house. I was able to see this is what it was like to sit here. And you can see in the painting, you see that's his house, and they're sitting out looking at the sea watchers. And so I did that, and used here like the accident that Michael has an accident, and up there the steps he fell down. There's the garage where he parked the old Buick that he loved, and that was just their house, you know. So it allowed me to imagine that I was living there, which I like to do,
and to imagine the personalities that were there.
Yeah.
I mean, I asked you earlier, how do you write children, but also how do you write Americans? I mean, the language in this book is very American. It rings true.
Well, I talk to myself a lot when I'm writing. You know, I'm talking away with the American accent. And in my head, it's an American accent. And I paid really particular attention to old movies and how people spoke.
I remember seeing a sentence where you say that at the end of the Labour Day celebrations, many of the parents are leaving the Kaplans with their children, and the children are contrary.
Yeah.
And I knew that if you were writing that in an Irish idiom, you'd have said cranky.
Yeah, yeah.
But contrary was right for the American context.
Yeah.
Did you read the work out to yourself afterwards?
I was terrified. I was terrified. It's interesting because, you know, as you know, with your experience of translation, it isn't always from language to language. Sometimes, you know, it's the nuance, or it's just the small things that make it work or make it irritating. And I was terrified of being accused of being stage American, you know. So I ran it by a few Americans first to tell me what.
And what did they pick up on? Did they suggest changes?
One person suggested it's very small change. I had, and I still think, I took it out though. I think I took it out. But I still kind of think I've heard it before. I've heard somebody, I know an American girl at school, I'm really sure she used to say it, if you're going somewhere, she'd say, you want to come with? And so the person I showed it, she said, no, but just in case I took it out, I think. So I got a few different people. But then again, you see, America's such a vast country that one person would think it's normal and the other person wouldn't. So I just kept mining while I was watching, while I was doing research, and you'd see a phrase. You mightn't use the thing, but you'd see the phrase and you keep it, you know?
I was also very struck by your focus on class and markers of class and markers of wealth.
Yes.
Particularly in the culmination at the end when they're all, the Novaks have arrived to take poor Michael away.
Yes.
And they're all in the house. And it's very obvious they come from very different planets.
Very different backgrounds, yeah.
Backgrounds.
Yeah.
How did you do that? I mean, did you make a maquette of the drawing room and the pregnant Mrs. Novak and the other people? How did you stage it?
I kind of did draw it, yeah. I did. I actually, I didn't tell you that before. No, I didn't tell anybody. I did draw where she'd sit and where someone else would sit and how they do it. And I did actually draw that just to get their positions. And then after that, I just moved them and I just saw it in my head. You see, I look at things before I write them. I imagine it first and then...
Like Hopper.
Yeah, like him. I look at it and then I write it, especially if it's going to have to move from here to there and here. And then this book is only seen from the point of view of 3 people. But everybody thinks there's lots more people. A lot of people don't notice that. They think there's loads of people's perspective, but there's not. We only see it from Michael, Edward and Joe Hopper. Yeah. And nobody else. So everything else is just... And if you stick to that, it makes it a little bit easier to get them from place to place and to get them around. So I only had to move Mrs. Novak upstairs for her nap, and she sees things, you see, and then I only had to move Joe and Edward.
I wanted to ask you about the markers of wealth and class that you've drawn attention to, particularly as the novel culminates on Labour Day and the aftermath. Why was this so important to depict?
I think it was inevitable that if you bring a boy who has lost everything and has nothing and probably didn't have all that much in the first place before, and you put him into, he's adopted by a couple who don't have a lot, they're blue collar New Yorkers, and then he goes to, it was just more interesting to bring him into a wealthy, and also to show that the war affected everybody, you know, because it affected everybody, and even though they don't know it at this point, very soon it's going to affect them again, because 1950, after the summer, was the Korean War started. So they were back at square one again. So I just thought that was interesting. And, you know, probably almost every novel that's written set in England or by an English writer is about class. Like almost everything is about class. But it's a much more complicated, whereas the American class system is a bit like our own. You can buy your way into it, more or less, you know. I know there's a few old families who like to think they're aristocrats, but by, say, the standards that the English like to use, they're probably not. But by and large, if you just keep making money, they look on that as class, you know. And here, it's the same. You can kind of move up very quickly. All it requires.
I thought Mrs. Novak's comments were very telling. They've been brought down to take away this little child because he's been accused of stealing $50, which at the time would have been
quite a lot of money.
A lot of money, but as she says in her inner voice, because she has a public voice and an inner voice, this wouldn't mean anything to these people. They're so rich.
You're right.
So
there's 4 people. She's actually the 4th one. Thank you for pointing that out. You think I'd know my own book. She's the 4th one. But she only appears in the beginning of the book and the end of the book. Yeah.
And she loves Michael.
She does love him. He's difficult. He drives her crazy. You know, it opens with the 2 of them in Grand Central Station, and him saying, I'm not going, when she sent him to Cape Cod, and they have this argument and the row, and she, you know, and then he goes, and then she comes to take him away because he's been accused of a theft that he didn't commit. Yeah. And that theft was something that actually happened in my own life. Not to me, but another child that I knew that was accused of stealing money that they didn't steal. And I never got over it. The person that did it because I knew it was a lie when I heard it, and I knew, and it wasn't my own children either, but I kind of felt a great injustice, that even though it was like 30 years ago, and I have harboured that, because it's out of my system now. I never think about it. I used to think about it on boil sometimes, even though the truth came out in the end, you know, that sometimes if a child is disadvantaged, or if a child comes from a background where, you know, it doesn't appear to be ultra respectable, that they can be blamed on things, and it has a huge effect on the child.
They're all automatically to blame.
They're automatically to blame. Yeah, they're automatically to blame. And I just think it used to happen to me, not for stealing money, but it used to happen to me a bit when I was a kid, you know, because there was a stigma attached to being from a separated family in Ireland at that time. I know it seems ridiculous now, but there was then. And it would be, what can we expect? It was easier to blame a child that came from that kind of a background, you know. So it always kind of stuck in my craw, obviously.
You got it out of your system.
Got it out now, yeah. I got it out of my system now. Yeah.
Going back to Edward and his constant searching for the picture, the image that he's going to paint. And it's so elusive, and it's so frustrating for him, and he's so obsessed and concerned that it's not coming, and he's worried that he won't get the next check. So that's in a way, I think, blocking his creative output. That's searching for that moment. How have artists who've read the book responded to that? Are you capturing something that artists are doing all the time?
Well, I imagine any kind of an artist, even a writer's the same. You're kind of, you don't know if it's going to work. You start a book, and there's nothing worse than saying it's happened to me. I've 80 pages in and I say to myself, this book is not going to work. There's a wonderful section in the beginning of The Life of Pi, at the very beginning of it, when he talks about how he had everything on paper. It looked so good, it was going to be a brilliant book, and it just didn't work. There's just something wrong with it. It just didn't work. And when I'm teaching, I often read that out to people. And it happened to me once, and it's a real, people go on sometimes about the difference between a short story and a novel. And I think that's the real difference. That if you write a short story and it doesn't work, time-wise, and the older you get, the more precious your time becomes, time-wise, you'll get over it quicker than if you write, you know, maybe a lot of a novel, and then you realise that maybe 6 months or a year has gone into it, and, you know, it hasn't worked. But anyway, I imagine it happens to artists. I mean, when artists have written to me and they've loved the book, but they haven't actually said that that's something that happens in particular to them. Some people, I think, probably put paint on the canvas first and see where it leads them. But he didn't. He liked to look at it first and to nurse it in his head before he did it. And I don't know how he did it, because, you know, I painted Cape Cod Morning. I had a bash of painting it. And not that I'm an artist, I won't be having any
As
career
you were
change.
writing the book, or afterwards?
As I was writing it. And I took an art class from a very professional artist, and it said to me, will you show me how the hell he did this? You know, hold on, I should show you. Because I'd do it and it'd look okay, and, you know, and then these lines, you know, I just couldn't get them. And she tried it, and she's really, really good, and she's kind of, you know, trained as, she's trained in that kind of architectural drawing, and couldn't get it. But it was just his own little inner geometrical thing that he had, that he was able to get it right. But anyway, so yeah, I wanted to see what it felt like to paint. I knew we could get the colours anyway, you know, and we could get the shape. And I have a book, it's too heavy to bring here. I have a book at home which is a ledger that he kept, and she kept, rather, I should say. And every time he finished a painting, she got him to do a little thumb sketch of the painting, and she wrote notes beside it, how the painting came about. This was the way she was involved. How the painting came about, how long it took, what materials were used, what size it was, and how much they got for it. And when you were saying he worried about the check coming in, by 1950 they were quite comfortable, you know, but they lived very frugally.
Canned food for suppers?
She didn't cook. Only a fool cooks. You go into the kitchen and you'll be a slave for the rest of your life, she said. When I say that of readings, there's always women who shout up, yeah, she's right. But anyway, that's what she felt. She just did not like to cook.
And her own life as an artist in your book, not Jo Hopper herself, but Jo Hopper the character. Is there an implication that the work is good and that it's just because she's female that it's not being taken seriously?
But she'd like to think, yeah.
Or is it all a delusion? Is she deluding herself?
Well, I saw a couple of her paintings. There's one in the library in Truro in Cape Cod, and I hate saying this now because it sounds so mean, but her tragedy was she wasn't an artist. She wasn't. She was like, you know, she was. I do the same myself actually, and it'd be any. You know, if you were able to get an honour in your Leaving Cert in art, you'd probably be able to do what she painted. She just didn't have that extra something that she longed to be an artist. Like she longed with all her heart to be an artist. The same way as I longed to be a ballerina when I was a child, but it was never going to happen, thumping and pounding around the place. But she longed for it, you know.
She was in love with the idea of being an artist. She was in love with
the idea, and she loved, and you know, even the way she spoke, she was florid language. He spoke very plainly, and he didn't like discussing his work.
And she pushes him and pushes him.
She's a harridan
throughout that summer in your book.
Yeah, she pushes him to paint.
She pushes him to paint, but she also pushes him as in she needles him and and makes his life unbearable so that he can't really think about making his paintings because she's constantly...
She nags him all the time.
Nagging him or worse.
Yeah.
And so at the end you turn it and you create this point of crisis where she hears other people making fun of her. She realizes that her husband has written a letter to a gallery owner apologizing for having to push him to look for somewhere to exhibit her work.
That happened. The gallery thing happened. She nagged him to show her paintings to the guy who ran the gallery that looked after his paintings, one of them, on Fifth Avenue. And he did it with much reluctance because he knew that they weren't going to be...
But he did exhibit them.
He didn't exhibit them, no, but Hopper himself carried them down and showed them, and they couldn't, you know, and I imagined that scene. I imagined my way into the scene, but I knew that he was embarrassed by doing it. I knew the other guy was embarrassed, so I just wrote the scene, but he did do that. That did happen. I can't remember if he actually wrote the letter apologising, but I used the letter anyway as a device in it to get the plot going.
And to keep the tension going because she's waiting and
waiting for to hear
will she
about
have
this.
her exhibition?
Yeah, but she did ask him about it a few times, I think. And when visitors called, he never had his paintings out, but she'd drag hers out and show them. She was, I know. Oh no, cringe.
But you don't put that into the book, really.
No, I've actually toned her down a good bit because I thought if I put in how I feel Jo Hopper really is, she would look like a monster. I actually don't, in my heart of hearts, think that she would forge that much of a relationship with Michael. Because the bottom line is she only wanted Edward and nobody else.
And that's played on near the end, where Michael says, "Can I come and visit you?"
Yeah.
And she hesitates. She doesn't actually say, "Yes, I'd love to see you again."
Yeah, no, she just doesn't want. She just wants Edward to herself, and whatever relationship they have, that, you know, a strange relationship. There's a very sad video clip that I didn't put into the book because it's years later when Edward Hopper's an old man and he was very ill and he came out of hospital, and there was something like 72 steps, I think, of stairs up to their apartment in Washington Square. And the Irish artist and critic and writer Brian O'Doherty, sometimes I used to be known as John Ireland as well when he was writing, I think. He was very friendly with the Hoppers, and he was particularly friendly with Edward Hopper, and he did a documentary on it, and it shows himself and his wife went to visit the Hoppers. Edward Hopper's so thin, he was so thin, and he brought a good steak. He thought a good steak dinner, you know, the American way, a good steak dinner would sort everything out, and he brought the steak. And he came to see him, and Jo Hopper said, "Oh, I'm not cooking that, I've just cleaned the kitchen." She just wouldn't cook it. And you see how thin he is, and he died shortly afterwards. He just kind of took everything he was a very passive man, you know. And she was quite... You redeem
their relationship in a sense in the novel, because you imply that there is a good deal of love there.
There is love and codependency, and there is something there. I mean, I think they both found life difficult, and he found it difficult to paint, to find a subject. She found it difficult because she was getting no recognition, and she really wanted recognition. I really feel that she could have been a writer. She's a great way with words, and she could have done something else, and she could have done work with her hands. She was really, really good at making rugs and all that sort of, you know, craft stuff, which, you know, requires an artistic sense as well. But there was some nasty things that I didn't include in it, I think, because we never know. How do we know really what goes on in a marriage? I just tried to keep to what I read that seemed true to me.
So you have the moment where he finally cracks, and he's forced, in a sense, to tell her that he doesn't rate her work and that it is of no artistic merit because she isn't an artist.
Yeah.
And you could have left the book.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
What persuaded you to write more?
The painting, Cape Cod Morning.
Ah.
The painting. You see, because I'd already looked at this painting, because he only did 2 paintings in 1950. This one here, which is Intersection at Orleans, a few different names, but a portrait of Orleans sometimes. And here, this one here is where Michael first sees Edward Hopper, who I imagined here, and that's the woman with the green dress who gives him the cookies. So Michael comes up here with the dog, you know. But this one here, and I made up that. So I had to look at the other painting that they did, and I looked at it and I looked at it, and I knew that it was Dawn, probably Dawn, and what was she doing there? And that is very like Joe Hopper there, except she's more buxom there, you know. She's a bosom, which she didn't have. She was quite small.
Perhaps the French lady.
The French lady, yes, definitely. The French lady was
influenced the painting.
Yeah. So I thought of that, and I said she's waiting for him. So I couldn't let it go. I had to have that. He leaves, he walks, he gets out of the car, and he walks, and he leaves her there, and he goes walking, and he disappears all night, and we don't know where he is.
And she thinks that's the end of their relationship.
And she thinks, but she decides to clean the house, and she scrubs everything, and she cleans everything. And then she decides he's coming back, and, you know, he might come back, and she loses it completely, and then she pulls herself together. She puts on an old pink dress, or her summer dress, and she combs her hair, she puts a bit of lipstick on, and she waits, and she's looking out, and she sees him.
Very 1950s.
Yeah. And I wanted this to be kind of that. And then I had the very last chapter where they you know, where it ties it up a bit, I suppose, what happens afterwards, because they just go on. The two of them go on, and they go on and they both know they will go on.
And the painting happens.
And the painting happens. And once that painting is made, they go home, which they did. I used, you know, the facts for that, when they arrived, when they went home, what he painted. So I was able to build around that, you know. Yeah. The French woman is kind of interesting too. She was a mysterious woman. Hopper was quite, you know, cute in a way. He spent time as a young man in Paris, and he went a few times, and there was a friendship that he had with a married French woman, and it was all kind of covered up except for a book of poetry, which I put into the thing where she signed
dedication,
dedication. So I kept saying, who is this woman who appears in the paintings? And when he's a young artist, there's some paintings, new paintings. Who is she? That's not Jo. He didn't know Jo yet, or he did know her. She was in class with them, but they had nothing to do with each other. He didn't really notice her. So yeah.
So he had his muses.
Yes, he did in the early days, I think, and then he kept it in his imagination.
So if I were to ask you to encapsulate it in 2 sentences what the book is about, what would you say?
Mamma mia, what's the book about? I don't know, I couldn't do that, I don't think, Sinead. I think it's about love, and I think it's about art and the creative process and forgiveness and loneliness, I suppose.
All the great world questions.
Yeah, I think it is about that.
Christine Dwyer Hickey, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinead.